A former teacher is raising awareness about Lyme disease through music after he was bitten by a tick on a school trip. 48-year-old Demetrios Loukas was diagnosed in 2013, 8 years after being bitten. Now he's releasing an album which is part of the Fight Lyme Now campaign, which aims to help sufferers of Lyme disease get diagnosed sooner. He joins us in the studio now. Hi Demetrios, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, tell us what happened. How did this happen?
Well, I was doing my teacher training in Oxfordshire. I was at university. I was on placement. We went on a school trip to a farm with the class that I was teaching. And I believe I was bitten by a tick. I developed a rash on my abdomen, accompanied with a fever. The fever subsided 24 hours later. I visited my GP, showed him my rash. He gave me an antifungal cream, so there was no what's the right word? There was no question, question, and there was no suspicion of Lyme.
And did you know that you'd been bitten when you were bitten? Did you feel yourself being bitten?
No, I didn't. I do recall a bruise-like lesion on my right calf. And I recall there being a puncture point, but I just assumed it was a mosquito bite that I had scratched unknowingly and irritated, you know?
Yeah.
But it wasn't, obviously. It was something far more lethal.
And did you? So obviously the doctor didn't suspect anything. Neither did you. Did you know anything about the symptoms of Lyme disease? Had you heard of it?
I had absolutely no idea. My background is my ancestry is from Cyprus, so I was accustomed to mosquitoes when I'd visit Cyprus. But I had grown up believing that biting insects that transmit diseases like malaria, for example, didn't exist in the UK, completely ignorant of that. Yeah.
And so why did it take so long? Is it not very common? Why did it take so long to diagnose? Well, because actually ticks are
they're very, very small,
uncommon.
I must say, having obviously studied the subject now, they're minuscule. Really, really small, almost like, I don't know, a piece...
Undetectable
No, like a fleck of black pepper, almost that small. They can be that small. So, and I wasn't even wearing shorts on the day of the trip. I was wearing long trousers. It was February, so it was cold. So, but we were at a farm and there were animals there, and there was a patting corner. I remember that. So I was accompanying the children. So that's where the transmission of the bite must have happened, around that area. And when you say why did it
take so long to diagnose?
Well, basically I started developing infections that became recurrent: Helicobacter pylori, which is a stomach infection, sinusitis, prostatitis, all very uncommon for someone of my health, because I wasn't a drinker. I didn't eat badly, I exercised, and then in 2011, I experienced a heart episode, and then I developed bradycardia and a heart block overnight.
So that was 6 years after...
Yeah, because I was quite strong. I believe my immune system must have resisted it. The depression also came around 2008. I just developed an inexplicable depression, and that was just uncontrollable.
So I think this would be a good time to bring in your doctor. So,
Dr. Newton, my colleague. He's a British research scientist.
Right, yes, and you very kindly introduced us to him, and he's helpfully joined us by phone today. And actually, it'd be really helpful to hear more about the condition and the symptoms.
Dr. Newton, you've been listening to all of this.
Yes, I have.
So this is not unusual for you, but it's unusual for the rest of us.
Indeed. I think the problem with Lyme, or certainly the diagnosis of Lyme, it crosses over with so many other conditions. And for example, you can have neck, shoulder, back pain, fatigue, drowsiness, muscle pain, joint pain, problems with sleep, cognitive difficulties, mental confusion, depression. These cross over with so many other conditions. For example, chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, just to mention two. So the diagnosis is difficult to make clinically, and so therefore you have to try and support the diagnosis with a test system, a laboratory test system, and the standard test that's used by the NHS and many other laboratories is what's called a serology test. So you're looking for antibodies to the infective or infective organism. In this case, it's an organism called Borrelia, but there are other organisms as well that can co-infect. And if you're unfortunate enough to be bitten by a tick that actually carries these things, you can have, up to 5 or more, a cocktail of different organisms. Anyway, going back to the test, I mean, it's said that it's highly specific. Well, yes, it is if the condition is absolutely gold standard Lyme disease. And what the manufacturers of these tests do, and I should say the NHS uses bought-in test systems, and the manufacturers are very careful to select very well characterized blood samples. In other words, most often from conditions called neuroborreliosis and Lyme arthritis, and those have been well certified samples, if you like, and the tests do come up. Sort of 90% of those cases come up positive. The problem comes when the tests are used for the more real world, I would call it, situation where you get presented with somebody with these kind of symptoms, and the test is often at best only about 60% accurate.
So is that because in a laboratory condition they use a purer concentration or whatever of Lyme disease, whereas in real life it's mixed with other things? Is that what you were saying?
Yes, possibly. I mean, yes. I mean, we had a survey running for about it's still running actually, but when I did the analysis on it, it was very clear that if you went to a GP and you got a diagnosis of Lyme disease, then the sensitivity or the chance of a positive test was at least 60%. But that's the thing. The difficulty is twofold, is that somebody presents at the clinic, the clinician will have very little time to make a diagnosis, very little time. Under the current system, the triage time available is not sufficient. It's a very, very complicated condition to make an accurate, what one would say, differential diagnosis, to try and differentiate it between other things. I mean, for example, from the survey, which is not a scientific survey, a survey can't be. It just gives you an indication. But the number one response from the clinician is chronic fatigue syndrome, and Lyme disease came about 7th down the list. Well,
so sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure that we understand. So, of course, the NHS and time with GPs is a big issue that's well talked about. I guess one of the reasons perhaps that they struggle is that they don't see the condition very often. I mean, how common is Lyme disease? Absolutely.
I mean, the incidence is the official figures for the incidence are probably up to about 5,000 now.
Per year?
But that's still not very high.
Are there any particular populations where it's more common, or any particular areas where they might concentrate expertise?
You tend to think of the forestry areas. I mean, a very good website for this is to go onto the Big Tick Project, and they will give you the sort of incidence and the probability of a tick carrying an infection in certain parts of the country. But, years ago it used to be thought, it's just the New Forest, that if you got bitten by a tick there, then there was more chance that you'd be infected with the Lyme organism. But, I mean, it could be in your back garden. It really could be.
So from what Demetrios was saying, they're absolutely tiny. You might not really be able to see them. And he was talking about mosquitoes, and of course we know that we can use DEET to help protect us. What can you do to avoid either being bitten by a tick or contracting Lyme disease generally? Or are there any vaccinations available?
No, the vaccinations, they're not available. The most important thing is to be hypervigilant, I think. Not to be scared, but if you see a rash, no matter what it looks like, the traditional rash is called a erythema migrans, or bullseye rash, and you can go onto the web and see loads of these. But sometimes people don't get the rash or get a non-typical rash. There's a very recent case in a local school, and I was involved in that. A little girl got a rash behind her leg. It was very, very difficult convincing the GP that they really ought to provide antibiotics quickly. That's the key. Yes. I mean, the difficulty is that testing, for example, testing you use to confirm a clinical suspicion, the tests don't work very well within a few weeks of being bitten. It takes a longer time for the antibody response to increase.
Thank you, Dr. Newton.
Is this analogous to, I mean, the last couple of days there have been discussion about sepsis, and again, once again,
Yes.
GPs not noticing it, and whereas if it was noticed at the very early stage, and
Yes.
the antibiotics were given in,
Yes.
the further down the line there would not be a problem. Is it a similar sort of thing? Should GPs be aware of both of these, or?
Yeah, they should. I mean, it's basically down to education program. The people, the medical professionals in the rest of Europe are much more aware of the problem. I mean, so really we need an education program in the UK. It needn't necessarily be in the medical side of it. It could be in the pharmacy side. You know, people could approach pharmacists for advice. That's the other way of doing it. But just going back to sepsis, the problem with sepsis is detecting it early enough. And it's similar to Lyme in that at the moment the tests are indirect. What we need for both is a very, very, well, certainly for sepsis, you need a very, very rapid test system.
Thank you.
Yeah, Doctor, that's fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. We must get back to Demetrios because we're running rapidly out of time, and so he's got a bit of entertainment for us, I think, which is telling them.
Yes, so Demetrios, thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you,
Newton.
Dr.
That's really helpful to
Thank you.
have that perspective and those expertise.